This is Professor Lynn Porter from Fairfield University, and this is my lecture on ancient Roman architecture and decor. These are the various topics I'm going to deal with in this lecture, starting with where in the world we are and when in human culture we are, what's going on at the time. Then we're going to look at a few different kinds of public structures and some construction innovations, including the contributions of Mr. Vitruvius, the Roman orders of architecture, the arch and concrete, the barrel vault and the dome. Then we'll also look at, in the decorative side, at moldings, domestic interiors, furniture, and sculpture. When we think about Rome, we tend to think of a city in the middle of Italy's boot. And that's the city of Rome, but in the ancient Roman world, we're talking about a huge amount of land all the way up into northern Britain, the entirety of what we would call Spain and France, large portions of southern Europe, large portions of northern Africa, and even over into Turkey and what we think of as the Middle East. So the Roman Empire at its greatest, now this is a drawing of it at its greatest, we're talking about a massive area of the world. In terms about when we're talking about, I want to break this down into three different time periods. First, there is the Etruscan period. This is the most ancient period of ancient Rome, um, heading up from 750 up to about 500 BCE. Then the heyday of the Roman Republic, which was from 500 to about the turn of the millennium. And then in the new millennium, we have the Roman Empire that goes on for almost 400 years, 500 years. So we're really talking about a tremendous period of time here, about 1,000 years in total. In terms of the things that make the Roman period unique, everything was about conquest and political dominance. It was a might makes right kind of rule. So everything was about the glory of Rome. So you have powerful, magnificent, grand and bold things, and we'll see that come out in their architecture. But I also want to point out that philosophy and the arts are of secondary importance. Everything is about physical power. The Romans were the kind of the magpies of the ancient world, so they borrowed from everybody else, and they thought very highly of the Greek world that they had overrun. So they based a tremendous amount of their work on Greek prototypes, but they didn't come at it from the Greek point of view about individual exceptionalism. So the Greek ideals were set aside, and we start to see more realistic, more realism appearing in their sculpture and decoration in particular. But the thing the Romans were amazing at was engineering. They engineered roads. They engineered astounding ways to move water from up in the mountains down into the center of cities. They were really quite astounding engineers. And they engineered vast structures, huge structures for public use. And we'll see some temples and amphitheaters and theaters. They also had basilicas and baths, circuses, forums, and triumphal arches. So numerous ways that they were using their architecture to proclaim the glory of Rome. So let's look at this a little bit. Let's just take a look at the temple. Here is a lovely temple in France, actually, southern France, which was part of the Roman world at that time, that feels a lot like, maybe this is kind of based on the Parthenon idea. But if you look at the diagram on the right, you realize, no, wait a minute. The Parthenon had individual columns all the way around it. This one only has separate columns on the front of it. And look, there's kind of a pedestal that this entire temple is set up on. You can see it more clearly in this photograph, how the entire temple is set up on a pedestal or on a podium. And so that was part of the Roman thing. Everything is up on a pedestal. So here you see the very deep portico. Portico is a fancy word for porch. And then the rest of the building has half columns, not full columns, but half columns that are stuck to the wall. That's called an engaged column. So it's a purely decorative thing. It doesn't help support the lintel or the beam up at the top. The wall is doing that, supporting that stone wall you see, but the columns are purely decorative. So you see what I mean about how it's borrowing a Greek idea, but then transforming it in a way that makes it uniquely not Greek? But the Romans were innovators. And one of the more important innovators, probably not at the time, but he became much more important later on, was Vitruvius. Now, Vitruvius was a man, he lived in the first century of right before the turn of the millennium. And he wrote a really important book. And copies of this book lasted for centuries. So here's a page from De Architectura that he wrote. It was actually a multi-volume book. This is actually a drawing of a Roman theater. We'll see those here in a second. And in his writing, he established standard proportions for the Roman orders of architecture. And his idea was, if I write down the standard, then other people can make Roman buildings, even if they don't have a good eye for it aesthetically. So he took the standard Greek orders and he Romanized them. And then his proportions, because he wrote it down in this book, his proportions formed the basis of the Renaissance styles long, long after Vitruvius was dead. So let's look at the Roman orders of architecture. Yes, the Romans used the Doric order, not very much. They used the Ionic order, but they altered it a little bit from the Greek. And they also used the Corinthian order, which is the most common order that you find in Roman buildings. But then they added in a few. They added in a Tuscan order, which is more akin to the Doric order than anything else, but it's even simpler than the Doric. Remember, the Doric is the order with just that round bun kind of a capital, and so it's the Tuscan order has a very similar capital, but the column itself doesn't have the fluting. They also added a new order, the composite order, that combines ideas from the Ionic and Corinthian, and we'll see how they combine them. So the composite order gets even more complicated than the Corinthian. And as I pointed out when we were looking at that beautiful little temple in France, they introduced the idea of a pedestal. And you can see in the drawing here, all of these columns are now sitting up on a pedestal. The pedestal is a very Roman idea. And they also came up with the idea of a pilaster. A pilaster is a square column that's engaged. It's hooked to the wall. So it doesn't have any structural value and it's purely decorative. So a pilaster is similar to the engaged columns we were just looking at, except a pilaster is square instead of rounded. So in addition to the three orders from ancient Greece, we have the new Tuscan order, we have the new composite order. That's the Tuscan is the very far left in this picture, the composite is the very far right, and then the pedestal base is to lift everything up. Taking a closer look at the capitals on the columns, you see the Doric, that looks familiar, but look at the Tuscan over on the right. You see how the capital is very similar, but the Tuscan column itself is smooth. It doesn't have those grooves or those flutes in it. The Ionic column looks very familiar, though the volutes are a little bit smaller than the Greek. The Corinthian looks very familiar, doesn't it? But take a look at the composite. You see how the volutes are bigger like they are with the Ionic? And there's more of that leafy stuff. It's more of those acanthus leaves from the Corinthian. So the composite was a very favorable idea here. I think probably simply because it's got everything thrown into it. It's very much a society that thought that more was better. And here in this image, in front, I have just a capital that you see how leafy and just decorated and kind of goopy it is, right? That is a composite capital. And then the photograph in the background is actually a piece of the Colosseum in Rome that has Tuscan columns, engaged columns at the very base of it. So those are some examples of the new Roman looks. But in addition to refining the use of the column and adding their own little unique details, the Romans did some other fascinating things. We can't talk about the Roman world and not talk about the arch. This is a diagram of the Roman arch. It is a true half circle. So you can swing this with a compass. And the most important element of an arch is the keystone there up at the top. It's called the keystone because it's the last one that you fit into the arch. And once it's in place, the arch becomes a freestanding thing. And with the invention of the arch, now we can have more distance inside a building, that we're not limited to a lintel on top of a column, and that really comes down to the strength of your lintel. Now we can set our walls very, very far apart and just have a beautiful arch connecting over top of them. And part of the Roman look of things was the walls themselves that held up these arches tend to be really hunky chunky because they have to carry a tremendous amount of weight from supporting all of the stones for the arch. And still standing today, here is a four-sided Roman arch in Spain. This would be at a crossroads where you could literally go one of four directions through this arch. But look there up at the top. Each one of those stones has been carved into the proper wedge shape. This was built in the ancient Roman times. And I have that diagram there on the right to just emphasize one more time. It is a true half circle. Semicircular means half of a circle. So it's a true half circle. And of course, when we're talking about the arch, we have to talk about concrete. All of this is possible because you have concrete that will hold all of these pieces into place. And the Romans mastered a recipe for concrete that made all of their engineering possible. It made it possible for them to build aqueducts, that's on the left here, for colosseums. They built multiple colosseums. It made it possible for them to build basilicas, which we'll get to when we get to the medieval time, and even triumphal arches, arches to celebrate the glory of a leader or of a military campaign. They are an arch to celebrate triumph. I want to show you just a couple pictures of these aqueducts because they're amazing. An aqueduct was really important because the water runs through streams and springs in the mountains, but there's everybody living down in the valley in the cities. So how do you get the water there? And this aqueduct still exists. It's in what is now Spain, but of course that was the Roman world at the time. And so you have these massive, miles and miles and miles long structures through the countryside that allowed traffic to go through them. You can see people walking through it, but it also allowed water to run. This is a view of the top of that aqueduct because they're they're engineered so the tops of them are gently slanted downhill. So it's a way to simply run water downhill, but you have to gradually dip it down over time to control the amount of water in the aqueduct. So what we're looking at here is the part of an aqueduct where the water actually runs, and the rest of it is just built up to get the top at the proper level. It's a pretty fascinating way to think about getting water into a city, isn't it? Like I said, they were engineers. And of course, we have to talk about the Colosseum because it's probably one of the most famous Roman structures. There you have it as it exists today. Part of it has been reassembled, part of it has been left unassembled and unrestored. And I want to point out another Roman idea. This was stolen from the Greeks, but the Romans really were the ones who put it into effect. It's called superimposed orders. And the photograph that I have here is actually a slice of a photograph from the Colosseum. On the bottom level, you have the Tuscan order of architecture. On the middle level, you have the Ionic order, and above that, you have the Corinthian order. So the orders have an order of importance, and they go from the strongest, simplest looks to the most decorated looks as you move up the building. That's what's called superimposed orders. And you see this throughout the Roman world. But back to the Colosseum. Here is an artist's rendition of basically a model of the Colosseum. We do know from writings that there was actually a roof over the whole thing, like a more like a sunshade or the top of a tent that could provide shade to people inside. We also know that it's a very steep building, could house thousands of audience members, and then in the middle, you could have all kinds of wonderful events. You could have people doing amazing feats of athleticism. They could even flood it and have mock sea battles. It's astounding the stuff that they did in these Colossia. And this is, of course, the Colosseum in Rome is the most famous one, but they built other Colossia throughout the Roman world, most of which don't exist anymore. But all of them are these series of arcades or arches on top of which that basically build the outside wall, and then inside of that, again, is mostly structured as a series of arches. I tell you, when they came up with that idea and technology to make the arches, they really leaned into it. And here is an aerial photograph of the Colosseum in Rome as it exists today. And part of what I want to show you with this photograph is that all roads tend to lead down to this central structure. So not only were they thinking about, I want to build one particular building for a particular purpose, they also were city planners. Of course, they weren't the first city planners, but just by seeing how various roads radiate out of the Colosseum, you see how important this structure was in the ancient world. We looked at some ancient Greek theaters, so I want to look at some Roman theaters too. Here is the exterior wall of the Theater of Marcellus still standing in Rome. It's no longer a theater. It has since been broken up and repurposed, and now it's a series of apartments. But you see how the outside of the theater feels very much like the outside of the Colosseum. So that structure was something that they used repeatedly. And here is a model of the Theater of Marcellus when it was still a theater. And you can see how they borrowed the Greek idea of a theater to a certain extent, but then they also changed it. While the Greek theater is built in the countryside in a naturally existing hillside, the Greeks wanted the theaters close at hand so they could build them as a freestanding structure anywhere they wanted to in a city. The orchestra or the performing area is now a true half circle, not the full circle like you see in ancient Greece. And the skene is now this multi-storied structure, not just a low structure built over which you could see the vista of Mother Nature's countryside. And part of what the Romans did to the Greek world as they conquered it was they took all of those beautiful Greek theaters and they remade them into Roman theaters, in addition to building their own separate Roman theaters throughout the Roman world. Here we are back in France, looking at the interior of an extant Roman theater. You see the semicircular orchestra, that playing platform on upstage of that, and then a multi-storied wall upstage of that. And if you can make an arch, you can make a barrel vault. A barrel vault is a series of arches strung together to form a kind of a tunnel. Again, it's a true half circle. This is a barrel vault that exists in Rome today in the Forum in the center of the city. And what we're looking at here is part of a triumphal arch, but I really wanted you to be able to see the barrel vault and just understand that in terms of technology, it's just a series of arches next to each other. And that is a technology that we will be seeing in other cultures too. And if you can make an arch and you're smart about it, you can also make a dome. Perhaps one of the most famous domes in the world is again right in the middle of the city of Rome today, the Pantheon. From the outside, it doesn't look like much, does it? It looks like it's got a bit of a Greek temple with a triangular pediment stuck onto a big, chunky building. But the magic is on the inside. If we take that entire building we were just looking at and cut it in half and look at it from the side, you can see how the Pantheon is structured. It is a true half circle of a dome on top of a cylindrical building. And yes, that Greek temple front is attached to the side. You see that out there to the right with the three sets of columns. And the inside of the dome itself, up on the curve, has a series of inset panels. That's called coffering. In fact, one of the curiosities of this building is that if you had a true sphere, it would just barely fit inside this building. So a sphere that completely fills the dome would come down and just barely rest on the floor. So it is as high as it is wide. That's part of the geometry and engineering of this space. So here on the left, we're looking up into the coffered dome, and there's a hole in the center. It's open to the elements. It rains inside this building. That's actually called the oculus, or the eye of the building. On the right in this picture, I'm showing you the Corinthian pilaster. There's a Corinthian pilaster, that square engaged pilaster, and then two separate columns holding up the curved lintel that then holds up the base of the dome itself. It's an amazing structure. It's almost impossible to photograph what it looks like inside this building, which is why all photographs seem to be kind of weirdly distorted. There's a magical peace that lives inside this building. There's something really wonderful about the geometry of this space. Okay, I also have to talk about the decorations. So let's look at moldings. Here you have a comparison of Greek molding shapes with Roman molding shapes. Again, the Romans stole everything from the Greeks, but then they changed them a little bit. And the thing that the Romans did was make all of the curves mechanical. You can swing those curves with a compass, whereas the Greek curves are all graceful freehand curves. So I want to go back and look at that arch of Septimius Severus that we were looking at before when we were talking about a barrel vault. And here we see all the moldings. And there's our old friend, an egg and dart. And underneath it, there's those square blocks. We've seen those before in ancient Greece. Those are called dentals, like your teeth. There's a leaf pattern, there's a scale pattern, there's human figures in there, there's that beautiful scroll. And it's like every single square inch is decorated, isn't it? It's like the more the better. If I can find a way to squeeze in something beautiful, I'm going to squeeze it in. Another view of the same arch. You see what I mean? Every single space is jammed in with some kind of fanciness, some kind of decoration. So while the Greeks were all about simplicity and all of the decoration being in beautiful horizontal bands, the Romans were about more is more. And when you start to see some moldings that feel almost goopy, they're so decorated, you're probably looking at something Roman. And if we're going to talk about the Roman world, we also have to talk about the domestic world. And we have a tremendous record of the domestic world from this time because something horrific happened if you were living at the time, but something marvelous happened if you live in our time. Mount Vesuvius in southern Italy was overlooking the town of Pompeii and Herculaneum, two major cities, and it erupted. The volcano erupted in 79 of the Common Era, and people had no warning. It just happened. And so all of the ash that fell out of the sky captured everything in place and preserved it for all time. So over the centuries, the area has been excavated, and we can find amazing things captured in that volcanic ash. And just as a reminder, we're still talking about a corner of the world that is Mediterranean. So the typical house was what's called an atrium house. It was a structure built around a central open air garden. That is the atrium. We're looking at one here. This is a ground plan view of one of the more marvelous houses that was preserved. And you can see that on the left there is a small atrium, and then there is a central atrium area, and then a large atrium area too. And a series of small rooms surrounding these open air, open roofed areas. But the front of the building is rather unassuming, isn't it? The fronts of houses were simply built out to the street along with the various shops around. So the fronts of the buildings kind of hide the glory of what's actually going on inside the house. Here we are in that center atrium. This is called the House of the Faun because of this dancing satyr statue in the center of this first atrium. There you see a more clear picture of the dancing satyr, how lovely and beautiful. And on the right, that's a reconstruction view of that room, of what we think that room looked like. So the satyr was probably dancing in a little pool of water. Further back in the building, you have that larger area. So the peristyle is that series of columns, but then you have again that open area in the center. Remember, these columns were holding up lintels, which were holding up ceilings. They didn't just stand naked like they are now. And remember, these courtyards or these atria are they're surrounded by really small rooms. So this is one of those small rooms looking out onto that interior courtyard. But something's going on with that floor. Look down at the floor. I wonder what that's about. Oh, wow. It's a mosaic that shows a battle of Alexander. I mean, how amazing is this? That is a series of small pieces of stone that have been very carefully cut and arranged to form a really intricate pattern, a decorative pattern here. In this image, you can start to see the individual stones that form the mosaic. Here is another mosaic from the same house. This one is the young Dionysus on the back of a tiger. On the left-hand side, I've shown you a close-up of this. I mean, it's really, really detailed work. And look around the edge. Look at that pattern around the edge. Oh, there we have that Greek or Roman wave pattern, that stylized wave pattern. So while the mosaic wasn't necessarily a new technology for the Romans, they really leaned into it. And there is numerous examples of really detailed artistry with mosaics that are built into floors, built into walls, just really some gorgeous stuff. Another one of the treasures that were hidden under the ash from the volcano blast at Pompeii are wall frescoes. And generally, with these frescoes, the wall is divided into three areas. At the top, there is some kind of cornice, which is the molding at the top of a building, or a frieze, which is a decorative band of molding. And then in the middle area is some kind of a scenic vista. Here in this fresco, we see this illusionistic painting of a series of columns going off into the distance. And in the lowest area, you have what's called a dado or a pedestal. Again, the pedestal keeps coming back. And we can even document a progression of styles over the years. So the first style or masonry style isn't as decorative as what I was just showing you, but you can see that there is this illusion of marble or masonry panels, and then a three-dimensional molding at the top and the bottom to help with the illusion. So those colorful panels in these two photographs are actually painted to look like 3D panels, but they're not. The second style that's documented is what's called the architectural style. And here you clearly have a sense of the illusion of architecture, that this room is not just a long, skinny room, but it's a window out into this very complex series of buildings and vistas. Here's another shot of that same room. You can see how they're using perspective to make it look like buildings move off into the distance. So there's this very flat wall, but it conveys this sense of being a 3D space. The third style, the ornate style, is very different, isn't it? Here you have a very dark background, but these tiny, delicate paintings floating on that background. Let me show you some close-ups. There you go. So this is really, really close up on that wall. So there's a delicacy to this style, and we're no longer pretending that we're looking out onto this fantastic city. Now we're just emphasizing the delicacy and the beauty within this one room. And so you have these other paintings that just kind of float on the background. And here you see that it's kind of a fantastical painting here. It's not at all an illusion of what you would see if you could look out the window. And then the fourth style, the intricate style, is really a combination of everything we've seen so far. So it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. There is that illusionistic architecture. It looks like columns holding up lintels. There is also the sense of vistas and something outside a window. You see that there in the corner of the room. But then you also have these paintings actually painted on the walls. So, and of course, they're paintings that are telling us a story. How cool is that? Obviously, we're looking at a very high level of craftsmanship. And of course, the houses that I'm showing you here are houses of the very wealthy. Let's take a look at furniture. Here we have some reconstructions of ancient Roman Klein and tripod tables. Like I said, based on Greek prototypes. Look familiar, don't they? And also, that's a great view of this floor that is a mosaic floor made of little tiny pieces of stone. and a fresco on the wall too. Wow. More tripod tables. Again, a very high level of craftsmanship and use of marble, carved marble. And so we're seeing in these pieces of furniture the same kinds of decorative motifs that we've seen in the architecture. It's mythological characters, it's animals, and these wonderful Greek and Roman decorative motifs. And what about the sculpture? What makes Roman sculpture specifically Roman? I think if there's one word you should think about, it's portrait. Remember with the Greeks, we were looking at idealized characters without a lot of facial features, or even if they did, it was about conveying emotion. And here, what we're seeing in ancient Rome is portraits of individuals. So here we have Augustus, one of the first emperors, and here he is rendered in three very different ways. On the left, there's that portrait statue, and that's really the statue of a scholar or a thinker or someone who's engaging in a conversation, maybe a senator. In the center, as Pontifex Maximus, he is now in the guise of the high priest, and then on the right, clearly he is in the armor of the great warrior. So, in addition to the facial characteristics of the human being, Augustus, we're also seeing him in the character of the various roles that he played in society. And that's through the costuming, actually. Here are some more examples of portraiture in the busts. You see, these are individual people. These look like guys you would run into at the grocery store, right? So that's what I want to get across here. Still a very high level of craftsmanship, but now we've taken that Greek idea of commemorating an idea through stone, and now we're commemorating an individual in stone. So there you go. We've talked about all of these different elements that come across in the architecture and decor of ancient Rome. Thank you for your time.